On Father's Day 1971, a mild-mannered father of 7 committed one of the most horrific crimes in Australian history. The man didn't attempt to deny what he had done, and he accepted his punishment. But what happened next would leave the community stunned and terrified. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime cults and heinous history. And today we are talking about the case of the Hope Forest Massacre. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first ever bake from frozen subscription box offering pastries, sourdough bread, and hand-cut pastas shipped directly to your door. You'll get to try out the freshest products from bakers and pasta makers from all over the country, and I love knowing that I'm supporting small businesses. Wild Grain boxes are fully customizable, and they're always adding new seasonal items and limited time items for you to try. Like last year around Halloween, they released these pumpkin cinnamon biscuits that were so good. The quality is top notch, and everything we've received has been delicious. And it's also convenient because everything is baked from frozen, so there's no extra prep time. You don't have to wait for the bread to thaw and rise. You just take it out of the freezer and pop it into the oven and bake. And everything is ready in 25 minutes or less. My box this month contained rigatoni noodles, churned French butter, Parmesan herb biscuits, snickerdoodle cookies, croissants, chocolate croissants, and sourdough bread. And Wild Grain uses a slow fermentation process, so their sourdough is easier on the belly, and it also has more antioxidants, and it can even lower blood sugar spikes. We love this sourdough bread. It's really crunchy on the outside and it's so soft and airy on the inside. This has become a staple at my house, but the item that I was really excited to try in this month's box were the Parmesan herb biscuits, and they did not disappoint. I added the churned French butter and they were so delicious with the perfect texture, and the flavor was just right. And Wild Grain also donates 2 meals for every order to the Greater Boston Food Bank and other organizations fighting hunger. So when you choose Wild Grain, you're also helping so many people in the process. And if you're ready to get your own Wild Grain subscription started, you can go to wildgrain.com/summer or click the link in the description box and use my code SUMMER to get $30 off your first box. Plus, you'll get free croissants for life. A big thank you to Wild Grain for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case. 40-year-old Clifford Cecil Bartholomew arrived at the home of his estranged wife Heather on Father's Day of 1971. Heather and Clifford had been going through a rough patch recently, and Clifford had high hopes that this might be the day that he reconciled with his wife and they started putting their family back together. Heather and Clifford had been married for almost 20 years. They had 7 kids together, ranging in age from 19 to 4 years old. The family lived in a small farmhouse in the Adelaide Hills in a remote area called Hope Forest in South Australia. Clifford currently worked as a truck driver, and he also worked part-time at the local slaughterhouse, and money was extremely tight for the family. You know, they had so many mouths to feed. When they got married, Heather already had 1 child from a previous relationship, and this child's name was Neville. The father was not in the picture, and so Clifford stepped up and he raised Neville as his own. And then they went on to have 6 more children. So in addition to Neville, who was now 19 years old, they also had 17-year-old Christine, 15-year-old Sharon, 13-year-old Helen, 10-year-old Gregory, 7-year-old Roger, and 4-year-old Sandy. And like I said, from the outside looking in, the family seemed overall happy. But everything changed in 1971 when a 22-year-old man, only known as Mr. X, moved into the area. We don't know much about Mr. X. He chose to remain anonymous after this case broke, but we do know that he was a Vietnam War veteran who had been wounded in battle. When he returned home to Australia, he became friends with the Bartholomew family, and at some point, Heather and Clifford invited Mr. X to move in with them, and he would rent out one of their rooms at the farmhouse. And it was kind of like a win-win because Mr. X could take it easy on this beautiful farm. You know, this place was really isolated and serene, and it would give him time to kind of rehabilitate from his time in the war. And the extra money and extra set of hands around the house would help out Heather and Clifford. So it seemed like a great idea at first, but things very quickly took a turn. Now, Heather had a younger sister who was named Winnis Keene. She lived in Sydney, and Heather would occasionally make the long journey to Sydney to go for a visit. Winnis had a 1-year-old son who was named Daniel, and she had an 8-year-old daughter named Nolene. And it was around Easter of 1971 that Heather decided to take a trip to see Winnis and the kids. But this visit was different than usual because Mr. X came along with Heather on this trip. Now, this was actually Clifford's idea. I'm not really sure why he suggested that Mr. X tag along with his wife. Maybe he thought Mr. X could provide some protection to Heather on the journey. Maybe Clifford just wanted a break from him. We just don't really know why he suggested it, but he did. The visit went well, though. Heather and Mr. X seemed to have had a great time, but it was when they returned home to the farm in Hope Forest that all the problems really started. Clifford started noticing little things here and there that made him wonder if Heather and Mr. X might be having an affair. He would see little glances between the two of them, some playful behaviors, and he also noticed that Heather would do little things for Mr. X that she didn't do for him. For example, Heather did all of the laundry for everyone in the house, including Mr. X, and Clifford noticed that she would always fold Mr. X's clothes and put them away for him, but she would leave Clifford's clean clothes for him to put away himself. And Clifford took this as Heather showing a preference towards Mr. X, and he was suddenly feeling very uncomfortable with the living situation. Now, whether or not this was all real, like there was actually some, flirtatious behaviors happening, or Clifford was just paranoid and nothing was actually going on between the two of them, we still don't really know for sure. But Clifford had become totally consumed by the idea that his wife was sleeping with this younger man who was living in their house. What were they doing during the day while he was at work? Were they in love? How many times had they been together? All questions that would have been constantly swirling through Clifford's mind at this time. Tensions became extremely high in that house, and at some point, Mr. X decided that it would be best if he moved out. He ended up moving about an hour away to an area in West Adelaide, and this would have been a relief to Clifford because now this man who he believed was sleeping with his wife, whether it was true or not, he was finally out of the house. And just maybe he and Heather could finally put their marriage back on track. But actually the opposite happened. Heather had gotten really fed up with the situation and all of the accusations, and everything kind of came to a head one day in August of 1971, just 1 month before an absolutely horrific event would unfold. Clifford found a letter that Heather had written to Mr. X. And we don't know what was written in this letter, but we do know that Clifford was completely enraged after he read it. He later described the letter as steamy. Officers would later say that this letter didn't seem steamy to them. They said that if a person was extremely jealous, then maybe they could see how it would be taken as flirtatious, but they found it more like something a mother would write to a son. And remember, Heather was 40 years old and Mr. X was only 22. Heather was old enough to be Mr. X's mother. In fact, Heather's oldest son was almost the same age as Mr. X. Neville is 19 years old. So while an 18-year age gap doesn't necessarily mean that a sexual relationship is off the table, there's a good chance that this whole thing was just platonic, and there is more proof of that, which we will get into later. So that day when Clifford discovered the letter, he was absolutely infuriated. He was 100% convinced that Mr. X and Heather had been having sex since that trip to Sydney back in the spring. And so Clifford confronts Heather about everything, and this turns into a massive screaming argument. Heather is adamantly denying that there was anything romantic going on between herself and Mr. X. She's like, "You're crazy. There's nothing happening. We're just friends." But no matter what she said, Clifford would not believe her. His mind was made up that she had betrayed him. So he ended up storming out of the house that night, and he moved in with his mother, who lived down the road like 10 minutes away. And this is how things remained over the course of the next month. Heather remained in the house with their 7 kids, and Clifford stayed with his mother. And in Clifford's mind, this was just temporary. He was holding out a hope that he and Heather would eventually get back together. They would reconcile, and they would put this whole terrible situation behind them. And so when Heather invited Clifford over to the house for that Father's Day celebration, he took this as a step in the right direction. And on Sunday, September 5th, 1971, Father's Day, Clifford arrived at the family home for the party. In addition to his wife and 7 kids, Winnis, Heather's sister, she had come in from Sydney, and her 2 kids, 1-year-old Daniel and 8-year-old Nolene, were also there. Now, a little backstory about Nolene, because this is important for later. Winnis had Nolene when she was a teenager, and the father was not in the picture. And since Winnis was so young and couldn't really take care of a baby all by herself, her aunt and uncle stepped in to help raise Nolene. They already had a few kids of their own, but they were all teenagers by that time, and so they offered to help Winnis out. They raised Nolene just like one of their own. She called her aunt and uncle mom and dad. She considered their children her stepbrothers and sisters. Then a few years later, Winnis met and married a man named Bill Keene, and they had one child together, which is 1-year-old Daniel. But they too were going through some marital problems at this time, and they were currently separated. Winnis was still a constant in Nolene's life. Even though they didn't live together, she still saw her all the time. She would go and visit. She would see her on special occasions and stuff. And that Father's Day, it was decided that one of Nolene's stepbrothers, Terry, would drive in from Adelaide and drop Nolene off at Heather's house so that she could attend the Father's Day celebration with Winnis. So Terry and Nolene showed up early that day, and instead of just dropping Nolene off, Terry decided that he would stick around for the party before heading back home. And this decision would actually save at least one life that day. And we are now approaching the devastating events that happen in the story, and I do want to give a warning that it's extremely disturbing. And I also want to mention that everything I'm about to tell you is all according to Clifford. This is his account of what unfolded that day. So Clifford arrived at the house for the Father's Day party, and according to him, things were awkward as soon as he walked through the door. He claimed that he was essentially ignored by everyone except for his youngest child, Sandy. Sandy had greeted her dad with a big hug, and throughout the day, she would ask him when he's coming home, because she missed him so much and she loved him so much. But aside from Sandy, Clifford claimed that he was practically ignored by everyone else. And as the day went on, things became more and more tense in the house. The mood was just off. It got so tense, in fact, that Terry, Nolene's stepbrother, he decided that it was time for him to go back home. And he also decided that he was going to take Nolene back with him. Terry later said that something just did not feel right that day. It felt like something bad was just waiting to happen, and he knew that he could not leave Nolene there. Even though that had been the plan, he just did not feel comfortable leaving her there. So Terry and Nolene, they leave and they go back home to Adelaide. Now, before Clifford left for the night, he decided that he needed to talk to Heather about the future of their relationship. Like I said, Clifford went into this day thinking that he and Heather were going to get back together. So he pulls Heather to the side and he asks her if there's any chance that they could reconcile. But Heather was not on the same page as Clifford. She wanted out of the marriage. This month apart had given her time to think, and she had decided that their marriage was just over. She wanted a divorce, and she told him that she was planning to make a fresh start. She planned to move about an hour away to the suburb of Rosewater. She and Clifford had lived there years before. She knew the area, and she thought that this would be a familiar place for her and the kids to start over fresh. Clifford was extremely upset, and his mind immediately went to Mr. X, because the place where Mr. X had relocated in the western part of Adelaide was very, very close to Rosewater. I'm talking like 10 minutes away. So in his mind, this was even more proof that Heather and Mr. X were having an affair. Heather was going to leave him for Mr. X, and Mr. X would just take his place in the family. Clifford once again stormed out of the house, absolutely enraged. And he decided that he could not let this happen. He headed back to his mother's house and he put an absolutely horrific plan into motion. He grabbed a rifle that belonged to his son Neville. It was a .22 caliber single shot rifle, and he also grabbed a large rubber mallet. He waited until about 1 a.m, and then he headed back to the farm. He quietly parked his car, grabbed the rifle and mallet, and he slowly approached the house. He carefully opened the front door and crept into the house as everyone was peacefully sleeping. Clifford first made his way to the main bedroom that he shared with Heather. However, Heather was not alone in that room. 3 of their children were also asleep in this bedroom. Before Clifford walked into the room, he set the rifle down, he leaned it against the door frame, and he approached the bed holding the rubber mallet. He claimed his plan was to knock Heather unconscious with the mallet, then quietly drag her outside to the shed, and that's where he would shoot her. But this plan did not work out the way Clifford was hoping. He struck Heather in the head with the mallet, but it did not knock her out. It just woke her up in a panic, and she immediately started screaming for help. Heather's screams woke up her sister Winnis, who was sleeping in the lounge. Winnis came running into the bedroom, which startled Clifford, and so he stopped beating Heather and he turned his attention to Winnis. He struck her once in the face with the mallet, but it wasn't enough to take her down. She ran out of the room, her face was bleeding profusely, and as she was running out of the room, she noticed the rifle leaning against the door frame, and she grabbed it. She ran out of the house, still holding onto the rifle. She jumped into a car parked in the driveway. She threw the rifle in the back seat and she attempted to start the car. But unfortunately, the car would not start. And by this time, Clifford had caught up to her. He dragged Winnis out of the car and onto the lawn, and he beat her in the head with the mallet. He then grabbed the rifle from the back seat of the car and shot her once in the head. Clifford then made his way back inside the house, and by this time, several of the children had been woken up due to all the chaos that was happening. And as Clifford was entering the house, he was met by his 17-year-old daughter, Christine. She was standing in the doorway. Christine was terrified and confused, and as Clifford was approaching her, she started pleading with him to stop. Christine, by Clifford's own admission, was his favorite out of all of his children. They had always been the closest. This might be why she had been brave enough to stand in the doorway as he was walking back in. Maybe she thought that she could get through to him. She was pleading with her father not to kill her, but Clifford didn't even hesitate, and he shot and killed his daughter right there in the doorway. He then stepped over Christine's body and he made his way back into the main bedroom to finish off Heather. And keep in mind, there are 3 children in this room with Heather. 13-year-old Helen, 11-year-old Gregory, and 4-year-old Sandy had woken up to the chaos, but they were so frozen in fear they just remained in the bedroom with their dying mother. Clifford walked into the room, shot Heather, before then turning the gun on his 3 children. The house by this point had broken out into pure pandemonium. The remaining children were up and running around trying to figure out what the hell was happening. They're screaming, and Clifford came face to face with his 15-year-old daughter, Sharon. She was absolutely terrified. She was running towards the front door when Clifford shot her through the cheek. This shot did not take her down though, and so she ran into one of the bedrooms and she hid under the bed. But Clifford found her. He pulled her out from under the bed and he shot her in the head. 19-year-old Neville was next. He attempted to overpower Clifford and they wrestled around a bit, but Clifford had all the weapons and so he had the upper hand. He first hit Neville in the head with the mallet in an attempt to knock him out, but this just kind of stunned him momentarily. Neville stumbled back into a bedroom before his father came in and shot him in the head. 7-year-old Roger met the same fate as the rest of the family. He was shot once in the head. And Clifford has just systematically murdered all 7 of his children, his wife, and his sister-in-law. And just as he thought he was finally done, he heard a faint noise coming from the front yard. So he walked outside and he discovered it was Winnis. She was still alive and she was moaning in pain. So Clifford grabbed the rifle and shot her once more in the head. Once he was satisfied that everyone was finally dead, he spent the next 20 minutes sitting at the kitchen table, drinking and becoming very intoxicated. But as Clifford was sitting there drinking, probably reflecting on what he'd just done, he realized that he had forgotten someone. 1-year-old Daniel was still alive. Clifford had forgotten all about him. So he got up from the table, grabbed the rifle, and he slowly made his way down the hall and into the bedroom where Daniel was still fast asleep. Clifford walked over to Daniel's little cot and aimed at this totally innocent sleeping baby and pulled the trigger. In less than an hour, Clifford Bartholomew had murdered 10 innocent people, wiping out an entire family. Now, Clifford claimed that he had intended to end his own life once he was done with the murders, but if that is true, he changed his mind for some reason. Instead, he continued drinking for a bit, and then he called his mother and told her everything. After that, he dialed the police, and he made a full confession that he had just massacred his entire family. The police arrived at the farm just after daybreak, and as soon as they pulled up, they could see Winnis's dead body on the front lawn. And as they made their way through the house, they were spotting dead bodies all over the place. And when they finally reached the kitchen, they discovered Clifford passed out drunk at the dining room table. He was put into handcuffs and taken into custody. And now that Clifford had been apprehended, police had the daunting task of locating all of the bodies in the house. And this was extremely traumatizing for these officers. Seeing these innocent dead children scattered all over the place, it was obvious that some of the victims had attempted to flee before being struck down. Some of them had tried to hide. 4-year-old Sandy, who Clifford himself claimed had been the only one to show him any love during the Father's Day celebration, asking him to come home, telling him how much she loved him and missed him. That little girl's body was found with her hands still holding on to her teddy bear. This scene completely broke the officers. It was just a total tragedy. After a full sweep of the house, they confirmed that they had 10 victims and there were 0 survivors. One by one, paramedics would put the bodies on stretchers and they would be carried out of the house. I actually found some really eerie news footage of the paramedics carrying out the bodies. There's no sound to this footage, which almost makes it creepier. And now the officers really needed to talk to Clifford. They needed to find out why this had happened. But Clifford was so drunk that police had to wait 8 hours until they could finally interview him. And once Clifford was finally sober enough to be questioned, he essentially placed the blame on Heather. He said that she had put him through months of mental torture because he believed that she was cheating on him with Mr. X. He admitted to the murders, but he claimed that everyone aside from Heather had been killed in a sudden state of panic. He said, quote, "I had to kill my wife. There was no other way out but to stop her from ever seeing Mr. X again. But somehow, with all of the screaming noises that were splitting my head wide open and that horrible look on my wife's face, I couldn't control my actions and just went on killing until everything was finally quiet. Once I had shot Christine, I realized that I had to kill them all. I couldn't leave any behind. I loved them all too much." So because he loved them so much, he had to kill them. This defense that he had just snapped and killed the other 9 victims didn't add up to Detective Alan Arthur, who was working the case. Detective Arthur said he went from one end of the house to the other, shooting everyone in sight. And he did it with a single-shot rifle. He told us during the interrogation that he took an automatic rifle along too, but he was scared that it would jam. So that tells you a lot. With a single shot, you have to reload every time, empty the barrel, and put in another bullet. He could have stopped at any time. He had to reload that rifle 11 times, and at no point did he come to his senses and stop. And also remember that he sat at the table and drank for 20 minutes before he suddenly remembered baby Daniel sleeping in the bedroom. He had at least 20 minutes to cool off and get a hold of himself. The screams had stopped, everything was calm and quiet, and he still chose to murder a sleeping baby. Now, the day after the murders, some officers arrived at Nolene's aunt and uncle's house to inform them about what had happened. Before Nolene could hear what the adults were discussing, she was told to go to her room and stay there. She attempted to hear what they were saying, but she couldn't really make anything out, and so she turned on the television, and there it was on the news. That's how Nolene learned that her mother and baby brother, along with her Aunt Heather and 7 cousins, were all dead. And the reality hit Nolene that if her brother Terry hadn't have insisted that she go back home with him that day, she would have been murdered as well. Terry had saved Nolene's life that day. And just prepare yourselves to be super angry with how this story ends. So Clifford had confessed, and he'd pleaded guilty to the premeditated murder of Heather. But as far as the others were concerned, he still claimed that those were not premeditated. The prosecution knew that they would get a mandatory death sentence for just the one premeditated murder of Heather, and so they didn't even bother trying to get him on the other 9 murders, which would turn out to be a horrible mistake. In December of 1971, Clifford Cecil Bartholomew was sentenced to death by hanging. In the mid-70s, as Clifford was sitting on death row, the death penalty was abolished in Australia, and any person who had been given a death sentence would now serve a life sentence instead. A life sentence to sit in prison and rot does sound like a fair punishment. However, unbelievably, Clifford was granted parole in 1979 after serving less than 8 years in prison. That is less than 1 year for each person that he murdered. How does that even happen? Well, for starters, since he was only sentenced for the murder of Heather, and the way that it was presented in the court documents, her murder was presented more as like a crime of passion. It was considered a domestic violence case. Also, the prison psychologist said that Clifford had been struggling with depression at the time, but he was all better now. He was considered a model prisoner, and he was likely to not reoffend. And so a mass murderer was released from prison and sent back into society. The prosecutors had every opportunity to convict him of the other 9 murders, but for some unknown reason, they never did. So yeah, 8 years for the massacre of an entire family doesn't really seem fair, but it gets worse. So after his release from prison, Clifford returned to his hometown of Port Adelaide, and he was hoping to just kind of blend back into society, but he quickly found out that he was not welcome. The community was completely outraged that he had been released in the first place. They did not want him living there, and they were rightfully afraid. And before long, Clifford started receiving death threats. So he requested that the court give him a new identity. That request should have been rejected immediately. This is a violent criminal. Even if he was only convicted of Heather's murder, everyone knew that he had killed his entire family. Giving him a new identity would allow him to move around society, hiding his crimes, which could be very dangerous for the community. People would have no way of knowing that this man had murdered 10 people. But nothing really makes sense in this case, so it should come as no surprise that this request was granted. Clifford was given a new identity, and he was even allowed to move away from the area, giving him the freedom to just create an entirely new life somewhere else, which is exactly what he did. He now went by the name Clifford Palmer, and by 1980, he had relocated to Victoria, and he wasted no time trying to meet someone new. He met a very devoutly religious widow named Merle Gray at a country western dance, and they immediately hit it off. Now, Clifford did eventually tell Merle that he had been in prison for murder, but he downplayed it about as much as he possibly could. First of all, he only told her that he had killed his wife in a fit of jealous rage when he had discovered that she had been cheating on him. He didn't mention that he had wiped out his entire family. And the fact that Clifford was out of prison at all, the fact that he had been released after only 8 years, that would have been proof in Merle's mind that his story was true. Because if it had been anything more serious than that, he would surely still be in prison. And because Merle was very religious, she was a very faithful person, she believed that she could save the soul of Clifford. And so she continued on with their relationship, and they got married in 1983. But here's the really bizarre thing. Merle had 7 children with her first husband. 7, the same number of children that Clifford had. Not only that, but the ages of Merle's children nearly mirrored the ages of his own children. And Clifford stepped in as their father figure. He helped to raise all 7 of Merle's children, and he raised them as his own. They called him Poppy Cliff, and they all absolutely adored him. He did all of the fatherly things with them. He played with them. He took them on fishing trips. He was grandfather to their children. Clifford would often babysit his grandchildren as well. And just stop and think for a moment back to the massacre in 1971. Clifford methodically going through the house and brutally murdering his entire family, pulling his daughter Sharon out from under the bed where she was hiding and shooting her in the head, killing his daughter Christine as she was begging for her life, murdering a sleeping baby in his cot. And now here he is playing house, blending into society like nothing ever happened. It's just sick. Merle and Clifford were married for 22 years. They moved around Australia a bit, and they finally settled in Queensland. And they lived this totally normal, happy, peaceful life. And then on November 27th, 2002, Clifford Bartholomew, aka Clifford Palmer, died at the age of 72. But even after Clifford died, his stepchildren still did not know the full extent of his crimes. They had heard that he had killed his previous wife in a jealous rage, but as far as I can tell, they didn't really know for sure if this was even true. I don't think that it was something that they ever sat down and talked about as a family. The way they described it, it was more of like a family rumor, but that all changed in 2012 when their mother, Merle, passed away. The kids were cleaning out Merle's house, and they happened to come across Clifford's prison discharge papers. And it was only then that the rumors were confirmed. But they still didn't know the full extent of his crimes because the discharge papers would have only listed his convicted crimes, so just the murder of Heather. Despite this case being the worst mass family killing in Australian history, most people didn't know about it. Somehow over time, the story just kind of faded into history. That was until 2018. In 2018, a journalist named Craig Cook from the Adelaide Advertiser started looking into the case for a potential story. This mass murderer had been released after only 8 years and just kind of disappeared. It sounded like a pretty interesting story. Like, where did this man go? So Craig started tracing Clifford's movements from the time that he was released from prison, and he discovered that Clifford had a whole new family, and this family knew very little about his horrific past. Before Craig's story was set to go public, he met with the family and he told them the full details of what their stepfather had done all those years ago, and they were in total shock. This man that they loved so much, this man who had stepped up and raised them, who treated their mother with so much love and respect, he had been a monster all along, and it was very hard for them to come to terms with this new sinister image of their stepfather. Craig Cook also managed to track down Nolene, who was now in her 50s. He found out that Nolene had spent her entire life terrified that her Uncle Barty, as she called him, would one day show up and kill her because she had been the one who got away. She suffered from nightmares and a slew of other issues due to the stress of the situation, and because Clifford had been given a new identity and just vanished, no one who had been close to the case knew what he'd been up to all these years. She didn't know if he was dead or alive. So when Craig reached out to Nolene, he told her that Clifford was dead. He had died back in 2002, and she could finally breathe a sigh of relief and stop living in fear. And there is one more twist to this story. During the initial investigation into the murders back in 1971, police had interviewed Mr. X. He totally denied that there had ever been anything romantic between he and Heather. He said they were just friends. And police also found out an interesting bit of information. Apparently, during his time in the war, Mr. X had been accidentally shot by friendly fire. he was shot 4 times in the groin, which left him completely incapable of having sex. Detective Arthur said he couldn't have sex as he had most of his bits and pieces missing and erections were out of the question. So again, we'll never know with 100% certainty that there was absolutely nothing romantic going on between Heather and Mr. X, but it's very unlikely. I think that Heather and Clifford were probably already having marital issues that no one really knew about, and the jealousy over Mr. X probably just pushed Heather to finally leave Clifford. And sadly, because Clifford was a hateful, twisted little man, he just couldn't stand the idea that his wife just did not want to be with him anymore. 10 innocent people senselessly lost their lives. Clifford is buried in Centennial Park Cemetery next to his second wife, Merle. His tombstone reads, "In loving memories of Clifford Palmer, dearly loved husband of Merlin, devoted to and sadly missed by children and grandchildren." And that is all I have on this case. Let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to check the description box for the link or go to wildgrain.com/summer and use my code SUMMER to get $30 off your first Wild Grain box, and you'll also get free croissants for life. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you guys to help out me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.